It's terrible that after 50 years, it is behind closed doors.
Stories about royal title clashes and dramatic council meetings make for compelling television. But the real mechanics of how titles move through the British monarchy are less about sudden confrontations and more about decades-long processes, constitutional convention, and, occasionally, a single sentence from a reigning monarch. The actual histories of Queen Camilla and Catherine, Princess of Wales, show how title changes really happen, and it looks nothing like a Privy Council ambush, a mid-meeting collapse, or a husband keeping his wife in the dark about a secret transfer of power. Camilla's title journey took nearly 2 decades. When Camilla married the then Prince Charles in April 2005, she did not become Princess of Wales, even though that title was technically hers to claim as the wife of the heir to the throne. The title was avoided deliberately, because it remained so closely associated with Charles's first wife, Diana, who had died less than a decade earlier and whose death was still raw in the public imagination. Instead, Camilla took the title Duchess of Cornwall, using the feminine form of one of Charles's subsidiary titles, a workaround that let her hold a genuine, senior royal title without directly stepping into a name still associated with so much public grief. At the time of the wedding, Clarence House also announced that Camilla did not intend to be known as Queen when Charles eventually became king. The plan, as stated publicly in 2005, was for her to become Princess Consort instead, a title that isn't part of standard royal convention and would have marked a deliberate, voluntary step down from what she was technically entitled to as the monarch's wife. It reflected just how cautious the palace was being about public opinion at the time. Polling in the mid-2000s showed only a small fraction of Britons supported the idea of Camilla ever being called queen. That plan changed because of Queen Elizabeth II, not a council vote or a family confrontation. In February 2022, on the eve of the 70th anniversary of her accession, Elizabeth issued a public statement expressing her sincere wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. It was a single sentence in a broader jubilant message, but it effectively settled a question that had lingered publicly for 17 years. The statement worked precisely because of who delivered it. An announcement from the sitting monarch, made publicly and unambiguously, carries a kind of settling authority that no subsequent internal meeting could ever replicate or overturn. When Elizabeth died in September 2022 and Charles ascended the throne, Camilla automatically took the title Queen Consort as a matter of established constitutional convention. As the monarch's wife, she takes the feminine form of his title, unless something else is specified. No formal ceremony or council decision was required for that part. It happened the moment Charles became king, the same instant Charles himself became King Charles III. The word consort itself was temporary, and its removal was a matter of protocol rather than drama. During the early months of her reign, palace officials used Queen Consort specifically to avoid confusion with the recently deceased Queen Elizabeth II. Using the word queen alone for Camilla so soon after Elizabeth's death risked sounding like an erasure of the late monarch. So the extra word created useful, temporary distance. At Charles's coronation in May 2023, Camilla was crowned alongside him and began to be referred to simply as Queen Camilla, following the pattern set by past consorts. The wives of former kings have historically been styled queen plus their first name once crowned, the same convention that gave the world Queen Alexandra and Queen Mary before her. That shift from Queen Consort to Queen was, in short, a matter of dropping a clarifying word once enough time had passed, not the result of any contest or transfer of power between royal women. It is also worth being clear about what the title does and doesn't mean. Camilla's position as queen carries no constitutional authority. The line of succession to the British throne runs through birth and statute, governed by the Bill of Rights of 1689 and the Act of Settlement of 1701, and explicitly excludes anyone who was not born into the royal family from ever becoming the reigning sovereign. Camilla's title reflects her position as the king's wife and consort, not any share of ruling power, and it never has. This distinction matters because a lot of the drama in fabricated royal storylines hinges on titles being treated as prizes that confer real authority, when in reality a consort's title is almost entirely ceremonial. Catherine's title is Princess of Wales, not Queen Consort. Catherine, meanwhile, became Princess of Wales in September 2022, when Charles ascended the throne and William became Prince of Wales in turn, the title inherited automatically by the heir apparent's wife, following the same convention that applied to Diana decades earlier. Catherine is not in line to receive the title Queen Consort, because that title is specific to the wife of a reigning king, not the wife of the heir. If William eventually becomes king, Catherine would then become Queen Consort herself, using the same convention that brought Camilla her title. But that would only happen after William's accession, not before it, and it would not require Camilla to be displaced from anything, since Camilla's position exists independently, tied to her own marriage to Charles. In other words, the premise of Camilla and Catherine competing for the same title doesn't reflect how the system works. The two titles exist in relation to two different men at two different points in the line of succession, and one does not come at the expense of the other. There is no scenario under current succession law in which Catherine receives Camilla's title while Charles is still alive and reigning. The only way that could ever happen is if Charles dies or abdicates and William becomes king, at which point the title moves not because of a family decision, but because of the automatic operation of the same convention that has governed royal consort titles for centuries. The Privy Council doesn't decide who gets which title. The Privy Council is a real body, a group of senior political and public figures, including government ministers and senior judges, who formally advise the monarch, most visibly through orders in council covering government and constitutional matters, such as approving certain public health regulations or formally confirming the results of a general election. But it is not the mechanism through which royal family members receive personal titles. Titles like Princess of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, or Queen Consort are governed by long-standing convention, letters patent, and occasionally direct statements from the monarch, as with Elizabeth's 2022 Jubilee message, not by a vote or announcement at a Privy Council meeting. Letters patent are a particularly important and often overlooked part of this process. They are formal legal documents issued under the monarch's own authority, used historically to create peerages, define styles, and settle exactly who is entitled to be addressed as Royal Highness or given a particular ducal title. George V issued letters patent in 1917 that still govern much of who counts as a working HRH today, and Elizabeth II issued her own in 2012 to extend the title Royal Highness to all of Prince William's children, not just his firstborn. These are quiet, procedural legal instruments, nothing like a dramatic reading in a closed chamber, and nothing that produces surprises for the people whose titles are being defined, since letters patent are drafted, reviewed, and typically publicly announced, rather than sprung on family members without warning. A closed-door council session abruptly reassigning a title, with family members hearing the news for the first time in the room, simply isn't how any of this has historically played out, and it isn't how the constitutional machinery around the monarchy is built to function in the first place. Title transitions in royal history tend to be slow, not sudden. Looking back at previous consorts helps put this in context. When George VI died in 1952 and Elizabeth II became queen, his widow, also named Elizabeth, did not lose her royal standing. She instead became known as Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, a new designation created specifically to distinguish her from her daughter, the new reigning queen. She retained enormous public affection and a prominent royal role for another 50 years, remaining one of the most popular members of the royal family until her death in 2002. The precedent there is instructive. Even when the same title effectively moves to a new generation, the tradition has been to create a distinguishing title for the previous holder rather than to strip her of status or push her out of public life. Prince Philip's decades as Elizabeth II's husband offer another useful comparison from the other direction. Despite being married to the reigning monarch for nearly 70 years, Philip never became king. The convention that gives a king's wife the title queen does not work in reverse for a queen's husband, who instead becomes prince consort or, as in Philip's case, simply remains a prince with his own separate titles. Elizabeth II did grant him the personal title Prince of the United Kingdom in 1957, but that came from her own decision as monarch, formalized through letters patent, not from any external body deciding to elevate or diminish either of them relative to the other. Diana's situation after her 1996 divorce from Charles is another commonly cited example, and it's a genuinely different kind of case. Diana lost the style Her Royal Highness and the title Princess of Wales specifically because the marriage ended, becoming known as Diana, Princess of Wales, rather than HRH, the Princess of Wales. That change followed a divorce, not a generational succession, and it was settled through the terms of the divorce agreement negotiated between the two parties rather than a surprise announcement delivered to a stunned family in a closed meeting. Notably, even then, Diana was permitted to keep the title Princess of Wales itself. Only the Her Royal Highness style was removed, which shows how even in the most publicly acrimonious title dispute in modern royal history, the actual legal process was negotiated and incremental rather than sudden. How other monarchies handle the same questions. The pattern of slow, convention-driven title transitions isn't unique to Britain. In Spain, when Felipe VI became king in 2014 following his father Juan Carlos's abdication, his wife Letizia became Queen Consort automatically and immediately, under Spanish constitutional convention, with no separate ceremony or council decision required to determine her title. In the Netherlands, Queen Maxima's title changed the moment her husband Willem-Alexander became king in 2013, again as an automatic consequence of his accession rather than a discretionary decision made about her specifically. Across European monarchies, the general pattern holds. A consort's title is a function of their spouse's position, determined by settled law or convention well in advance, not something contested or awarded through internal palace maneuvering once the moment arrives. Why the invented version is easy to believe, and why it matters that it's not true. Stories like the one describing a Privy Council ambush and a public collapse spread because they take something real, genuine, well-documented public tension over how Camilla was received for years, and real questions people have about how William and Catherine's roles will expand as they move closer to the throne, and dramatize it into an invented scene with fabricated dialogue and a fake medical emergency. Camilla's decades-long path to being accepted as queen was genuinely difficult, and at times, publicly humiliating for her, particularly in the years immediately following Diana's death, when public affection for Diana ran so deep that even modest public appearances by Camilla could draw hostile reactions. That real story doesn't need an invented council meeting to be compelling. If anything, the true version, a title question that took Elizabeth II's 17 years of public sentiment watching to resolve with one sentence, says more about how the modern monarchy actually navigates delicate family and public relations questions than any invented confrontation could. It shows an institution that moves cautiously, waits for public opinion to shift, and settles contentious personal questions through the quiet authority of the reigning monarch rather than through internal drama. It's also worth noting how this kind of content typically spreads. Videos built around invented royal crises tend to borrow real names, real historical facts about past title changes, and real photographs, then weave in fabricated dialogue, private confrontations, and medical emergencies that never happened. Because the real facts are mixed in with the invented ones, the fabricated parts can be difficult to separate out without independently checking the underlying claims, which is exactly why it matters to trace a story like this one back to primary reporting rather than taking a dramatic narration at face value. A timeline of what actually happened, laid out chronologically. The real sequence of events looks considerably less dramatic than any single-night confrontation, but it's worth walking through because the gradual pace is itself the point. In 1981, Diana married Charles and became Princess of Wales, a title that would go on to define public expectations for the role for the next 4 decades. In 1992, Charles and Diana separated, and in 1996 they formally divorced, at which point Diana kept the title Princess of Wales but lost the style Her Royal Highness, a distinction settled through the divorce negotiations rather than any public announcement of the kind seen in dramatized accounts. In 1997, Diana died in a car accident in Paris, an event that reshaped public sentiment around the monarchy for years afterward and made any future use of Princess of Wales or discussion of Camilla's status extraordinarily sensitive. In 2005, Charles and Camilla married, and Camilla became Duchess of Cornwall, with Clarence House publicly stating she would become Princess Consort rather than Queen when Charles took the throne, a voluntary, publicly announced choice, not a decision imposed on her. In February 2022, Elizabeth II issued her Jubilee message expressing her wish that Camilla become Queen Consort, effectively overriding the 2005 plan with her own public endorsement. In September 2022, Elizabeth died, Charles became king, Camilla became Queen Consort by automatic convention, and William and Catherine became Prince and Princess of Wales, inheriting the same titles Charles and Diana had once held. In May 2023, Charles and Camilla were crowned, and Camilla's style shifted from Queen Consort to simply Queen Camilla, completing a title journey that had unfolded, start to finish, across nearly 2 decades of incremental, publicly documented steps. Nowhere in that actual timeline is there a moment resembling a closed Privy Council session, where Catherine's name is read aloud as a replacement for Camilla's title, nor any point at which Charles is documented as having concealed a title decision from his wife until she heard it announced alongside everyone else. The dramatic tension in the invented version comes specifically from compressing what was, in reality, a slow and heavily telegraphed process into a single shocking night. Reading royal news critically. Because the British monarchy generates enormous public interest and relatively little day-to-day access for outside observers, it has become a common subject for speculative and outright fabricated content, particularly on video platforms where a dramatic thumbnail and confident narration can make an invented scenario feel like breaking news. A few practical questions can help separate real royal reporting from invented drama. Is the claim attributed to a named source, a palace statement, a specific journalist, an on-the-record royal correspondent? Or does it rely entirely on an unnamed narrator describing private thoughts, feelings, and conversations that no outside party could plausibly have witnessed? Fabricated content about the royal family very often includes precise dialogue and internal monologue for people who have never given interviews describing those exact private moments, which is a strong signal that the material is invented rather than reported. It's also worth checking whether the central premise is even structurally possible under how the institution actually works. In this case, the premise collapses immediately once you know that Catherine isn't eligible for the title Queen Consort, while Charles is alive and reigning, and that the Privy Council doesn't have the institutional role the video assigns it. Understanding a few of the basic mechanics, who is entitled to what title, and when and which bodies actually have a role in royal governance, makes it much easier to spot when a story has been built around a premise that isn't real, even before checking any individual factual claim within it. What's actually unresolved? The genuinely open questions about the monarchy's future are less about a title clash between Camilla and Catherine and more about longer-term structural ones. How much of the working royal family's ceremonial duties will eventually consolidate around William and Catherine as Charles's reign continues? How the king's own health affects the pace of any handover of responsibilities, and how the family manages public expectations as generational transition approaches. Catherine's own public role has expanded steadily since 2022, and William has spoken publicly about wanting a shrunk and more focused monarchy for the future. But those are gradual, publicly discussed shifts in emphasis, not the product of any secret document or sudden reassignment of a title that was never Catherine's to receive in the first place. Those are real, still developing stories worth following on their own terms, just not the one told in council chamber collapse videos circulating online.